All right, well, it is 10:02, so I guess we will get started. So thank you so much for being with us here this morning. We're really excited to be here talking with you about how to support LGBTQ plus young people. My name is Tracy Mckay. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of the program managers at Greater Boston PFLAG. I am also the very proud mom of 3 children, 2 of whom are transgender. So this work is very personal and very meaningful to me in a lot of different ways. And I'm here with some colleagues. I'll have Emma. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma. I'm the program assistant, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
Thanks, Emma. We have a couple of speakers coming. I know one of them is here. Noah, are you here? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Noah, and I use they, them, and he, him pronouns, and I'm part of the PFLAG Speakers Bureau.
Thanks, Noah. And I'm not sure, we have one more speaker. Bonti, are you here yet? I don't think so, no. All right, well, you will hear from Bonti in a little bit. You will hear Bonti and Noah tell their stories. So before we go any farther, I'd love Emma just to talk a little bit about the housekeeping and about how things will work today.
Sure, absolutely. So you can tell y'all are muted, but we still want to hear from you. So throughout this presentation, there are going to be a lot of question breaks coming up. So if you have a question in the chat, please direct message it just to me, and I'll read it out during question break. When you do it to me directly, it's anonymous. No one will see your name, and we can keep it that way. But let's say you have a question that's really personal and you really want to have a conversation with Tracy or myself. I'm going to be putting our personal emails in the chat, and then after the training, we can have a conversation. So I'm going to shoot it back over to Tracy.
Thanks, Emma. All right, so we're going to dive right in. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And we can get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is just to give you a little bit more information about PFLAG. So we at Greater Boston PFLAG are one chapter in a national organization. And our mission really is to foster LGBTQ plus inclusive spaces, whether that's families, workplaces, communities, houses of worship. And we do it through 3 kind of buckets of activities: support, education, and advocacy. So with regard to support, we have 16 different support groups going on currently. Right now, they're all remote, but we're hoping to get back in person soon. We have some support groups that are open to everybody. So members of the LGBTQ plus community, friends, family, allies. And we have some that focus more specifically on the support needs of parents and caregivers. We also have a helpline, so people can call in to get support and get resources. And we also have a one-to-one program, so we can connect folks on a more individual basis if that feels more comfortable. With regard to education, this is what Emma and I spend most of our time doing. We go around to a variety of organizations, we talk to people of all ages, and do the kind of work together that we're going to be doing today. And then finally, advocacy. We work really hard to make sure and do the best that we can to make sure that the laws in Massachusetts and beyond protect and support this community. So that's Greater Boston PFLAG. What are we going to do here today? We're going to give you some background information to provide some context about why this is important to be having this conversation. We're going to learn about some language and terminology. We're going to focus on 4 specific concepts: gender identity, sex assigned at birth, gender expression, and sexual orientation, and really look at how they are 4 separate and distinct concepts. We're going to learn how to be more inclusive with pronouns. And finally, you're going to hear from some of our young speakers as they share their story. Now, as we start off on this work, we like to present some guidelines at the beginning of each training to kind of guide our work. And the first one is we want this to feel like a safe space for people. But I do want to be mindful that a space that feels safe for me might not feel safe for everybody. So we maybe want to reimagine it as thinking of it as a brave space, a space where you can ask questions, even if you're not really quite sure how to ask them, a space where you can bring your curiosity. And the other thing about having something feel like a safe or a brave space is confidentiality. So while we certainly want all the lessons that you learn here to leave with you, we hope that you'll leave maybe some of the stories and some of the questions from your colleagues here in this educational space. We hope that you'll assume good intentions, both from all of us at PFLAG as well as from your colleagues. And then especially if this topic is kind of new to you, really as we go through, notice and explore what areas feel comfortable, what areas produce a little more discomfort, and just kind of think of that as we go along. So before we present any more material, I would love to hear from you all. I'd love you to put into the chat what it is that you're hoping to learn from this training today. What are you hoping to get out of it? Something that you're wondering about. Please go ahead and throw it in the chat, and Emma can read out what folks are hoping to learn about today.
So we have folks saying how to be a better ally, how to support my LGBTQ family members, the difficulties of being a LGBTQ plus student in today's school system.
Oh, great.
Surface blind spots I'm not aware of.
Great.
Good strategies to be inclusive and provide authentic support for all students, including LGBTQ plus students.
Wonderful. Excellent. So hopefully we will touch on all of that through the material that we present. And also, I think you'll get a lot of that through hearing folks' stories. But if there's a question that doesn't get answered, please make sure that you put it in the chat and we can talk about it. So with that, as I said, we're going to start with some context, some background. And I like to think about this as the why part of this. Like, why are we having this conversation? Why is it important? Because if we don't really understand why, or we don't really get behind why it's important, we never really get to how to make things better. So that's what we're going to start off with. So I want to think about some challenges, particularly for LGBTQ plus youth. Now, one of the things we know is that often the LGBTQ youth are hearing negative comments about this community in their homes with their families, whether it's at the dinner table, whether it is in car rides, just in various conversations. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to be hearing comments, negative comments about a community that you know that you're a part of from the very people who are supposed to hold and protect you. And you can imagine how difficult it would be to come out and share that part of yourself with those folks if you are hearing those types of comments. Now, another place where kids spend a lot of time, obviously, is at school, and someone mentioned this as well. What we know is that school is often not a very safe and welcoming place either. So these are some statistics from the GLSEN National School Climate Survey, and I've just pulled out a few to illustrate this. So you can see it's pretty alarming. 86% of LGBTQ students say they were harassed or assaulted at school. 84% of trans students feel unsafe at school. And then I think this one is alarming as well. 60% of students who reported that harassment said that school staff did nothing or asked them to change their behavior to get the harassment to stop. And I think that that speaks volumes to the type of climate that these kids are walking around in every day. And then when you add the layer of race, we see that 2 in 5 LGBTQ students of color reported being bullied or harassed because of their race or ethnicity. So you can see it's quite challenging, and it should come as no surprise that this has consequences. LGBTQ youth who are experiencing this type of harassment have lower GPAs and higher levels of depression and anxiety. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, this is a national survey. Certainly here in Massachusetts, the laws are better. We tend to be a little bit more liberal, so things aren't that bad. In some way, this is true, but when you look at the numbers, they're really not that much different. So it really speaks to the fact that laws by themselves are not enough. We really need to work to create change in the climates that these kids are in every single day. Now, as we go through this, one of the things I want to keep top of mind is that we really can't talk about gender identity or sexual orientation without looking at the other identities that intersect with them. So things like race, ability, nationality, religion, class, all of them come together to create unique experiences and challenges. So those intersections really affect how folks experience the world and how they are treated. So for example, my daughters as trans women, that's certainly a marginalized identity. but they are also white, middle class, college educated. So their experience of being trans women is going to be very different than, for example, a trans woman of color who is not only dealing with transphobia, but also racism, and likely a whole host of other challenges as well. So we know that having multiple marginalized identity can really amplify some of the challenges and statistics that we just saw. So as we think about how to support the LGBTQ people in our life, it's important to look at all of these identities. Now, I just wanted to give some statistics to show how this plays out in the real world with regard to youth. So you can see, one thing we know is that LGBTQ youth often have higher rates of depression and anxiety, but they don't often get the support that they need. So when we break it out in terms of race, we know that for youth of color, that the number of kids that are receiving support drops significantly. Also looking at, if you look at Native American or Alaskan Native LGBTQ youth, they are 2.5 times more likely to report a suicide attempt. And then when we think about school, we know that Black LGBTQ youth are 13% more likely to be sent to detention or suspended than their non-Black LGBTQ peers. So these are some of the ways that intersectionality plays out on an everyday basis. And then finally, the final piece of why this is important is that accepting adults are incredibly powerful. So this is a statistic from the Trevor Project, which is an amazing organization supporting LGBTQ youth. And you can see that what they found is that LGBTQ youth who had one accepting adult anywhere in their life were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in that year prior to the survey. We would all hope that the people that are accepting these kids are the people that they live with, but that's not always the case. So the fact of the matter is that you can be that accepting person for these youth, and it makes a huge difference in their lives. So that's the why. So now how do we get to make things better? How do we get to create these beloved communities where youth feel supported and affirmed and accepted? And I think that one of the ways to do this, or the first step, is to really educate ourselves with regard to terminology and concepts. So that's what we're going to start off with now. So as we go through these concepts and think about these terms, I want to lay the foundation by thinking about this idea of binary versus spectrums. We are so used to thinking of things as binary, right? Two options, someone's a boy or a girl, they're old or they're young, straight or they're gay. But what we know as we go through these concepts and think about them is that they are much better understood as spectrums, where there's lots of possibilities, no boundaries. We're not putting people in boxes, just lots of possibilities. If you look even at something of binary like old and young, right? That's not really a binary. If someone asks that question, there's some context around that. So old or young for what? It depends on who's asking the question. There's a lot of someone can be an infant, a toddler, middle-aged, an aging person. So there's really a long spectrum, even though we're used to thinking about it in terms of the binary. So as I said, we're going to talk about 4 specific concepts. And the first one is sex assigned at birth. So this is when a baby is born, a doctor and midwife looks at that baby, looks at their anatomy and assigns them as either male or female, and that goes on their birth certificate. So for about 98% of us, this just works out fine in that a doctor or a midwife is able to put us into one of those 2 categories. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the category that we come to know that we belong in, but they are able to do that. But for about 2% of folks, just because of natural variations in things like anatomy, hormones, chromosomes, someone is not able to put them in one of those 2 buckets. And for those folks, they might identify or be identified as intersex. And I like to bring it up here because it shows us that even when we're strictly talking about bodies or just looking at biology, those 2 buckets can't contain us all. We are too much unique and variable ever to be put, all of us, into one of 2 boxes. And 2% sounds like it's not a lot of people, but 2% is actually the same incidence as people who have red hair or green eyes. So there's a lot of people who fall into this category. So the second concept is gender identity, and that is your own internal understanding of who you are with regard to gender. Do you identify as a man, as a woman, maybe both, or maybe neither? So for example, for me, when I was born, the doctor looked at me and said, "This is a baby girl." There hasn't been a moment in time since that time where that hasn't felt right and authentic and correct for me. So my sex assigned at birth matches what I know about myself, my gender identity. So I identify as a cisgender woman. It's just an adjective. It tells you one thing about me, that my sex assigned at birth matches my gender identity. Now, for my daughters, that wasn't true. When they were born, the doctor said, "This is a baby boy." But no matter what I named them or how I dressed them or how short I continued to cut their hair, they knew that wasn't true about themselves. So they identify as transgender women. Again, it's just an adjective that tells you one thing about them. Now, when we think about the term transgender, I often say it is an umbrella term. And that is because there are lots of different ways to experience being transgender. It's a very diverse community. And one of the ways to think about that is that for some transgender folks, this binary system feels fine. It works for them. It feels authentic. They identify as men or women, and that feels right for them. But that's not true for everybody. Some people will identify outside of that binary, and you might hear the term non-binary. So again, for folks who identify in this way, they could be assigned male or female or intersex at birth, but they don't strictly or persistently identify as either male or female. So for some folks, they may feel that their gender blends elements of both the masculine and the feminine. So they exist somewhere on that continuum. Other people might feel that where they are on that continuum changes over time or is kind of fluid. And for other folks, they feel that their gender exists outside of that binary altogether. So they might identify as a third or even fourth gender, just completely off of that continuum. And as we learn more about non-binary folks, one thing we've come to know is that there are a lot of people who identify in this way. There was a recent study done by the Williams Institute in California that just came out that said that there are 1.2 million adults. Now, this is just people 18 to 60. 1.2 million adults who identify as non-binary, and that is 11% of all LGBTQ plus adults. So when you add in people who are under 18, you see that there's really a lot of people who are identifying in this way. You can see on the screen some terms that people might use to describe how they identify. And while they certainly do have kind of general definitions, they do mean different things to different people. So if someone were to tell you that they identify in one of these ways, the best thing that you can say is, "Thank you so much for sharing. What does that mean to you?" And that will give you more information, the information that you need to be respectful for that person. Now, the third concept is gender expression. So if gender identity is your internal knowledge of who you are, gender expression is how you express that to the world. It can be things like hair and makeup, clothing, your activities. And like many things in our society currently, there are kind of strict rules about what is appropriate gender expression for men and boys and girls and women. But for a lot of folks, their gender expression doesn't fit into those two boxes. So you might hear the term gender expansive, and that is really when someone's gender expression differs from what we expect from them based on their sex assigned at birth. Again, they're just expanding that idea of what's appropriate gender expression. You might hear a term gender non-conforming. They mean the same thing, but I think gender expansive does a better job of explaining what the concept really is. And it also gets away from that, the idea of conforming. There's a certain amount of judgment with regard to conforming or non-conforming. So we really use the term gender expansive, but you might hear gender non-conforming as well. Now, these concepts that we've just talked about, gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and gender expression, they all are regard to gender, and they really come together to contribute to how we see or perceive somebody. But the problem is that that person may not want to be seen or perceived in that way. So what we really should try to do is make as few assumptions as possible about someone's identity or how they identify, just based on how they look or their name or what we know or think we know about what's on their birth certificate, and just really trying to get away from making assumptions. Now, we've been talking about gender, but it's also important to talk about sexuality. So this last concept, the sexual orientation, is really who you are attracted to physically, romantically, emotionally. Now, we live in a very heteronormative society. So when someone meets us or we meet somebody else, it's generally assumed that that person is straight. So straight men attracted to women, straight women attracted to men. But certainly that isn't true for everybody. So you can see at the bottom, in the bottom box, some terms that people might use to describe how they identify with regard to sexual orientation. And as I said before, these terms definitely do have kind of general definitions, but they mean different things to different people. So again, if someone tells you that they identify in this way, thank them for sharing that and asking them what that means to them, because you might get a different answer from many people, different people that you ask that question. Now, the one term that I do want to talk about is the word queer. So people often wonder if they can use that word, or sometimes it makes them uncomfortable when they hear the word queer being used, because it really does have a long history of being used negatively to hurt people. But recently, it's been reclaimed as really a positive, powerful word by folks who hold that identity. So really taking a word that has been used negatively against them in the past and using it to really celebrate a wonderful part of who they are. You see that more with younger people and in certain geographical areas like ours. But I would say that it's a word to use with caution if you don't hold that identity yourself. So for example, I would never use the word queer to describe how someone identifies unless I know 100% that that's the word that feels right for them. Because while certainly I would only be using it in a positive way, you don't know how it's going to be received. So just thinking about that. Now, the last term that I want to talk about is, or concept, is this idea of questioning. And that's really just discovering and exploring these four concepts that we just talked about. We all do it. It happens at any time during our lives. It's just a normal part of human development. And I like to point it out because questioning is really an invisible identity. So, we don't know, even with those closest to us, we don't always know what's going on in their minds and in their hearts. So it's important to understand that, because when we think about how we interact with people, the language that we use, the assumptions that we make, we want to make sure that we are being welcoming and inclusive, no matter who we're talking to, because we really don't know who's listening. So at this point, that's a lot of information. So I would love to stop and see if anyone has any questions before we do one last piece and then move over to our speakers. Emma, do we have any questions?
Yes, so someone wants to know if you can further explain the concept of gender expression.
Gender expression. So really that is gender expression. Again, it's just how you express yourself to the world. So thinking about the things that, the way you dress, maybe the expressions that you use, the activities you like, all those external things that people see. I always like to say that it's really the things that make you feel comfortable, confident, and happy, right? Again, how you dress. So for example, like my gender expression, I would say is mostly feminine, but I don't remember the last time I've wore a dress. And despite what I'm wearing right now, I usually don't have anything with a print or a flower. So, my gender expression is kind of not ultra feminine, but kind of heading in that direction. So it's really just those external things that we see or that other people see. And again, I like to think of it just what makes you feel happy to do, what makes you feel comfortable, and what makes you feel confident in how you express yourself to the world. But people see that and usually gender it in some way. So I hope that answered your question. If it doesn't, please ping us back again to get more.
Sure. Somebody wants to know, what does demisexual mean?
Great question. So demisexual really isn't about who you are attracted to. demisexual is how that attraction or refers to how that attraction happens. So someone who says they identify as demisexual would say, again, different people might explain it different ways in terms of how it relates to them, but generally speaking, it means that someone doesn't experience that physical attraction to somebody until they have a close emotional bond with that person. So whether a person is attractive or not, would not even come into question until that strong emotional bond is in place.
Absolutely.
Any other?
No, it doesn't look like we have any other questions at this time.
All right, so we'll move on. The last section I'm going to do before I turn it over is talking about pronouns and how to use pronouns in a way that is inclusive. So if we look at pronouns, the first thing to think about is that pronouns really matter, right? Pronouns go so far beyond preference. They go to the heart, really, of who we are. And when we use the correct pronoun for someone, it shows that we see them, that we respect them, and we value them. So it is so worth getting it right. So if you look at this chart, of course, the ones on the top, she, he, are ones that we are all familiar with. But then about 30, 40 years ago, people started to say, you know what, we need new words in the English language. Those don't feel right for me. So folks started coming up with new pronouns, or you might hear the term neo-pronouns, which just means a whole group of new pronouns. So you'll see one here at the bottom, Z, here, here's is one example. AM, air is another example, and there are lots of others, but those are two that you might hear. Another one that you might hear, and I'm sure you already are hearing, is they used in the singular. That's most often used by folks who identify as non-binary. Sometimes I get a little pushback on this because people will say to me, you know, I can't use that because it is not grammatically correct. And what I would say is that if we know it's important to someone, and we do, does that really matter, first of all? But second of all, it actually, in the last few years, both the Merriam-Webster Dictionary and the Oxford Dictionary have come out to tell us that that is grammatically correct to use they in the singular. So it certainly is grammatically correct. It's been around for a long time. Shakespeare used it in this way, Jane Austen, Chaucer. So it's been around this way for a long time, and it's not going anywhere. And if you think about it, we use it in the singular all the time. So if we were watching this scene play out and we didn't know the gender of the person on the tightrope, we might say, what are they doing up there? Or I hope they don't fall. Or if you leave a meeting and someone has left a water bottle, you might say, oh, I hope they come back for it. So, excuse me. So we're using it this way all the time. We just need to practice when someone asks us to use it for them. And when I say practice, I really mean practice, like practice in the mirror, practice with friends, with colleagues, practice with other people outside of your interaction with that person who is asking you to use that pronoun for them, because with practice, you will be more successful. We're going to put some resources in the end of this training. Emma's going to pop some things in the chat, and one of the things she'll put in there is a website to help you practice pronouns. So, so that could be really useful to you. Now, there are certainly ways to use pronouns to create a more inclusive place. The first way to do that is to share your own pronouns. So if you notice when we introduced ourselves, we use our pronouns. It is here on our little Zoom box there. And that's just a way to really show that, that you are a visible ally, right? You know enough to know that pronouns are important. It also does a couple other things. So when myself as a cisgender person introduces myself with my pronouns, it's not because I'm afraid that you won't know what to call me, but for lack of a better word, it kind of normalizes the process. So it makes it so that trans folks aren't the only people who are constantly having to give their pronouns. And it also shows that you don't want to make assumptions. You don't want to assume what someone wants to be called just based on maybe what their name is or how they look. I would say, as this becomes kind of a more normalized part of your practice, you do want to leave space for it to be optional. And I say that not because I worry about cisgender folks who may think it's a mouthful or not understand why it's important, but you want to leave it a space to be optional so that folks don't feel like they're outing themselves when they're giving their pronouns. So what that might look like, if you're starting a meeting, you could say something like, well, to start, why don't we go around and share our names, and if you're comfortable, sharing your pronouns. So that's a way to kind of get it out there, give people the opportunity, but also make it optional for folks as well. The next thing to think about is if you don't know someone's pronouns, it's okay to ask. You can do that by saying something like, I use she, her pronouns. Can I ask what pronouns you'd like me to use for you? That's a way that you can ask. And usually folks are very receptive to having you ask that question. The next thing to think about is using they as a default. So if I don't know someone's pronoun and there's no way for me to ask them, I will usually use they. Now, that may not be the pronoun that they ultimately want me to use for them, but they is a much more inclusive pronoun, and it's much better to use that than to try to guess he or she and get it wrong. So think about using they kind of as that default. The next thing that is to think about is people always wonder what to do when I make a mistake. And you will make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time with someone's pronoun or someone's name. But the best thing that you can do if you've made a mistake and used the wrong pronoun is to correct yourself in the moment. And that's really important. Correct yourself in the moment. And then, move on quickly, but remember for next time. If there's a space for a small apology, either in the moment or afterwards, that's fine. But what you will want to avoid is kind of over apologizing, because if you're doing that, you're putting a spotlight on someone who maybe is already feeling pretty uncomfortable, and you're also kind of making it more about you. So correct yourself in the moment, move on, and then remember for the next time. The next thing to think about is kind of thinking about your culture with regard to pronouns and creating a culture of accountability. And what I mean by that is creating a space where it's okay for people to correct one another if they've used the wrong pronoun, either for yourself or for a colleague. So it's okay to respectfully correct people. And also when someone corrects you, the best response is thank you. Because even though it might seem kind of uncomfortable, that person has kind of gone out on a limb to help you be more respectful for those around you. So just to say thank you. And finally is respecting boundaries. And what I mean by that is that some people will feel safer using their true pronouns in some settings, but not others. So I know that can feel confusing, and it feels like, it makes us worry again that we're gonna mess up or make a mistake. But understand when someone is doing that, they're not trying to make things hard, and they're not making things tricky, but they're really prioritizing their own safety, and that's important. The other thing to think about regarding boundaries is recognizing that some people feel most comfortable not using pronouns at all, and they would rather just have you use their name. So getting into the practice of that, and that's also a great default too. If you don't know someone's pronouns and you don't want to use they, using their name as much as possible can be very helpful. So with that, I'm going to say, Emma, are there just a couple of questions that we can take before we turn it over to Noah?
Sure. What are some good gender neutral language to use when speaking to a big group of people?
Awesome. Great question. So we have so much gendered language, like ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, mom and dad, all of those kinds of gendered language. So what we really want to do is replace them with, you can use, of course, it depends on who you're talking to, but folks is a great one. I've started to use folks a lot. Emma will throw out a lot of y'alls. So folks, y'all, when you're talking to young people, you can, depends on what the setting, but you can say students or, artists or whatever, is whatever you can use, thinking of spouse, partner, those are all some great alternatives to gendered language. Am I missing any other ones that I could throw out?
Yeah, I've heard like friends, folks, friends, y'all. I've heard humans before.
Yeah.
Children, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
For sure. I really like humans.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
And it does really, it makes having that, making a really strong practice of using those inclusive language really does lead to a more welcoming space. So thanks for asking that question.
Absolutely. And it does take practice. It took a really long time to get rid of guys out of my vocabulary, but it does just take a lot of practice. How would you recommend coaches approach pronouns if they're meeting one-on-one with a student?
So I guess, just as we talked about, I think the best thing you can do is when you're introducing yourself, or maybe you haven't made this practice yet, and so now you're starting, is really to just call out your own pronouns first. So if you're meeting someone, say, my name is Tracy Mckay, I use she, her pronouns. What pronouns would you like me to use for you? Is a great way to get started. And if you've already been working with that person, you could say, hey, I've been thinking about pronouns, and I don't think we ever talked about it. I use, he pronouns. What pronouns are most comfortable for you? Or can I ask what pronouns are most comfortable for you? So that is a good way to sharing your own usually will jumpstart that conversation. The other thing is, and I don't know how you all do this, but if there's any kind of forms or surveys that you have your students fill out, making sure that pronouns are part of that, give folks an opportunity to put their pronouns on the form. Especially if you're working with young people, sometimes it's nice to go a little bit deeper. So you can ask a question like, what pronouns would you like me to use for you? And are there situations in which you'd like me to use a different pronoun? Some kids or young people might want to use a certain pronoun with you, but they might not want that to be the pronoun that you are using with, for example, family members. So you can dig a little deeper with a survey. So those are some ways to approach pronouns.
Absolutely. Or if you have a door with your name on it, you can put your pronouns underneath that. Or if you have a plaque in your office with your name on it, maybe your pronouns. Also, I don't know if coaches email students, but we always talk about the importance of putting pronouns in email signatures.
Yeah. And again, it goes even beyond like those kinds of messages or those kinds of visible symbols, whether they're verbal or, as Emma said, if you've got them on your door or in a name tag. Again, it not only gets you the information about pronouns, but also signals to that young person that you are a person who's comfortable having this conversation. Again, at least enough to know that pronouns are important. So what I would love to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Noah, and then we can get some more questions after that. So Noah, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. Hi, my name is Noah, and I'm an art therapy major, biology minor at Lesley University, and my pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I think I've always been queer, but I didn't always have the language to describe myself. When I was younger, I knew that gay people existed, but I assumed that I couldn't be one, that it was the thing that like other adults did. And part of the reason of this is because my mom was accepting where my bio dad was not. My mom brought me to one of the first legal gay marriages in Massachusetts. It was her friend's, and because I was a toddler at the time and apparently didn't have enough manners, I asked for and received the first piece of cake at someone else's wedding. She also showed me articles about transgender people. And so when I was 5 and I talked about marrying my best friend's older sister, she was like, okay, maybe my kid's a lesbian. And then when I was 7 and I learned that I would go through puberty and develop breasts and got obsessed with figuring out how to stop that from happening, she was like, okay, maybe my kid's a trans man. And both of those are almost the truth, but not quite. Regardless, I couldn't tell her what my truth was at the time because I still partially lived with my bio dad, and he wanted to be able to control every aspect of me, which included my gender and my sexuality. And so I was like, okay, fine, I'm a girl, I'll be a girl. But even with my decision to be a girl, I couldn't be a straight girl. So when my friend asked me out at 13, the first thing I did was I went, Mom, Amanda asked me out. And she was like, no dating till high school. And that was it. That was coming out to my mom. And although my mom said that, she was not an especially strict parent. So when she brought Amanda and I to the movies and she noticed that I had red roses and Godiva chocolate, she didn't say anything. And so after that, I was out. I was out to my mom, I was out to my brother, and I was even out to people at school with mostly positive, results. Some people at school were mean, but they're middle schoolers. However, I still didn't want my bio dad to know. He did have gay friends, but he told me that being gay was a choice and I needed to make sure I made the right one. When he found out I had trans friends, he refused to use their pronouns and was really transphobic. Unfortunately for me, I was outed by my middle school guidance counselors. And when it happened, it kind of felt like the end of the world. But a few months later, my bio dad lost custody of me for child abuse. You would have thought that that would have been a good time for me to like finally deal with all these gender feelings I'd been having since I was a little kid, but it didn't feel safe to do so. I still felt his influence, even though he was, even though I never saw him and he couldn't come near me. So when I was 16, I was like, okay, I'm now gonna think about it. And I kind of brought my mom along on this journey with me. And I told her, I was like, okay, I'm not a girl, but you can still call me she. And then I was like, okay, I'm not a girl and you can't call me she anymore. And we slowly just progressed through my gender till we got to the point where I am now, where I identify as like non-binary. And sometimes I use the word transmasculine, but mostly just kind of doing my own thing with my gender. At this point in my life, I'm surrounded by accepting people. All of my close friends are trans, which is really cool. And I get to be myself in this work I do. I get to be myself in the other nonprofit work that I do. And I feel incredibly lucky for that. Unfortunately, I do still deal with transphobia, often in the form of medical transphobia. I'm a chronically ill wheelchair user, and I have to go to the hospital more often than the average person does. And unfortunately, people can be quite transphobic, which can be scary when you're having physical health issues and you're like, can we just ignore my gender right now and like focus on the fact that I can't breathe or whatever? But yeah, I think what's most important to me and feeling respected in my gender is when people just try to use my pronouns. It's not always their success rate. It's the fact that I know they're trying. And I know that even if they mess up, they still see me as myself. And that's what my whole journey has been, being seen as myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah. So I have a couple of questions to get us started and for Noah, and then please feel free to ask questions either on the material or for Noah. But one of the things, Noah, I have two questions for you. One, and you alluded to this kind of at the end, these are folks who work with young people. What would you, outside of pronouns, or what are some ways that you would suggest about for being good allies? Anything that has helped you other than pronouns has helped you in the past or different situations? What would be your advice?
Sure. So at my school, I have like some people I work with that I consider good allies. And one of the things they do is they kind of like do some of the research for me. Like, for example, I have to do internships with my school, and like my internship, the person who I go to for internships, he will like tell me other students, other trans students' experiences at the sites. He can even like ask sites questions so that like I don't have to do that, and I also don't have to go into situations like with no idea how I'm going to be treated. So I think that's like a big thing for feeling like an ally. I also like speaking up for when other people misgender me is really helpful.
Thanks. So definitely educating yourself and being here today is so important. So as Noah says, it kind of takes the burden off folks if you are doing that work. The other question I have for you, Noah, is that I noticed that you, when you introduce yourself and you said in your Zoom signature here, you do use both they and he. I know that can be common. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe why that feels right for you and how folks should approach that when they meet somebody who is using two pronouns like that?
Sure. So people use multiple pronouns for different reasons. One assumption I have, and I kind of mentioned it, one assumption I get a lot about my pronouns is someone will be like, oh, so you're like kind of a man, right? And I actually don't really identify as being a man or a woman at all. Like I still feel very non-binary in my gender identity. It just so happens that I do like when people call me he. It feels good, but it doesn't feel good enough for me to only be called he. So I use both they and he pronouns.
But when someone, it was, if these coaches are working with a student who does use both, do you appreciate it when someone asks you which one to use, or do you feel like people should just feel free to use either?
Um, I'm cool with people using either. If someone's close to me and they ask me what to use, I tell them, like, my specific preference is for people to use they 80% of the time and he 20% of the time, but I usually won't get into that with people who I don't know very well.
Okay, great. Emma, are folks wondering anything? Any questions that we're getting?
So we have a question for Noah. Noah, what are some of the most affirming spaces you have found yourself at school?
That's a good question. I will, like, honestly, so I do go to Lesley University, and I don't think there have really been any spaces where I felt like fully affirmed. I was recently like at a space for transgender people, and then people started saying kind of racist things, and like I was one of two people of color, and I was like, I'm just leaving. Like, I don't have to put up with this. But I haven't, like, I feel like going back to like intersectionality, I feel like I can be like parts of myself in whatever space I go into. So like in that space specifically, I could be queer and trans, but I couldn't be like Black and Indigenous, which I also am. And I also have found like similar issues with like me being a like visibly disabled person, where like I can like they'll have spaces, they'll be like, oh, this is a trans friendly space, and it's like upstairs or something. So unfortunately, I'm still looking for school spaces where I feel like fully affirmed and supported.
Thanks for sharing that, Noah, because that is such a great, that's just so, just shows exactly that concept of intersectionality and why it's so important, and that we need to, if we're going to support somebody, we need to think about all their identities in order for them to feel completely themselves in different spaces. So thank you for sharing that. That's just a great real world example. Emma, are there other questions?
Yes. So you said Noah, you said the word trans mask to, so someone wants to know what that means.
Sure, yes. Trans masc is just short for like trans masculine. It's like, I kind of think of it as trans man light because I don't identify with like the word trans man, but sometimes I identify with the word trans masculine because like I am transgender and I am transitioning to like a more masculine gender identity.
Yeah, and I think that again, that points out like terminology, like, you know, I think one thing as allies we can do is make sure that we are using the terms that people use for themselves. So again, different terms, if we ask someone else to define trans masc, they might come up with a slightly different definition that fits for them, and that's okay. So as allies, just using the trusting that person knows what the right term is for them and using that term for them. Any other questions, Emma?
Yes. So someone wants to know, so they are working with a trans student who hasn't legally changed their name and are wondering about how do we navigate that as they enter college, and when can they legally change their name? So for example, when they have to sign their dead name, it's really hard for them.
Okay, so I'm actually in a similar position. I've been going by Noah for years and I still haven't changed it legally just because it feels like a lot of hassle. So on like when I applied for college, I was able to put my like real name for me, Noah. I was able to put Noah in a spot on all the applications, and I pretty much only had to like write my legal name in a few places. And when I signed my name, I did sign Noah Stang Osborne, and I didn't really have problems with that. My school lets you do IDs based on your chosen name. I'm not sure how common that is for other schools, but like my ID has only ever said Noah, even though it's never been legally changed. And like even on rosters and stuff, it says Noah. So you might have to do a little digging to find out how to like get there, but it is possible. Like to the point where I forget it's not legally changed because last time like there are a few systems where it does have my legal name in it. And so like if I get like certain like IT help, they'll be like, hi, dead name. And I'm like, oh, gross, don't do that. But outside of that, I do like honestly forget that no, it's not my legal name because of like all the workarounds there are.
So I would add just to, I'm not sure, I can't remember if this has come up in today, but now we use the term dead name, and that is the term that the name that someone is given is at birth. It doesn't really reflect who they are. And it's very, as you know, as Noah pointed out, it's really uncomfortable to have using that name. I will say from my own experience, for you can change your name if parents are, if you can change your name below the age of 18 if parents are on board with that. Some parents are not, so kids who would like to do that are not able to do it. There are also lots of other barriers. It's expensive. There's a lot of bureaucracy. It depends on what county you live in terms of whether you have to go before a judge or you don't. So sometimes if a person has not changed their name legally, it's not because they don't want to. There's just other barriers. So anything that you can do to make your own systems such that that they are able to, folks are able to use their chosen name, and as Noah suggested, really doing some digging into the colleges that the kids are going to find out, to help them to ease that, because being called by your dead name is not a comfortable experience. My daughter changed her name 6 years ago, and is still to this day goes to the hospital and sometimes has her dead name on her medical bracelet. So it's a thing really to educate yourself on, and to really to try to advocate for that student for. So Emma, any other questions?
Yeah, so we have a question. Can one of y'all further explain what's going on with the anti-trans legislation within like sports that's going on right now?
Noah, do you want to start, or do you want me to?
I'll let you start.
Okay, and then you jump in. So as there are literally hundreds of anti-trans bills that are popping up across the country right now. Most of them are targeting trans youth, and in two different areas. One is not allowing trans youth to participate in the sport that matches their gender identity. And the second is with regard to medical care, not allowing youth under 18 to have any kind of gender affirming care at all, making it actually a felony in some states to provide that care. And I would say that both of those are incredibly, incredibly dangerous for trans youth. This is a group who have lots of challenges, higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicidality, not because they are trans, but because they are dealing with this kind of discrimination in the world. So not allowing them to get the medical care that is essential for them, and this is something that is backed up by the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and on and on and on. Not allowing them to get essential medical care, not allowing them to participate in sports like every other youth around them is incredibly dangerous. So that's what I would say. If you look on, you can do some looking around on the web. Freedom for All Americans is a great website to go on to find out more about where these bills are, and also to find out ways that you can get involved in helping to oppose them, even if you don't live in that particular state. And while I will say we all think in New England that we are kind of immune to this, these bills have cropped up in Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. So it's here. I don't know, Emma or Noah, do you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to say I actually put that in the chat. If you want to track all the anti-trans legislation going right now for youth, I just put that in the chat. It's for the Freedom for All Americans.
Thanks, Emma. I will also say too, if you go onto our website, there is a page on our website that has kind of like frequently asked questions or more specifics about yes, particularly in this sports, kind of looking at some of the reasons that folks are saying that these legislation needs to happen, and kind of the actual truth of the matter. So checking it out on our website is a great way to get more information as well. But that's part of being an ally too, is really becoming involved in opposing these types of bills that are so dangerous for trans youth, as well as helping to learn more about the Equality Act, and getting the Equality Act passed is essential for this community. Emma, maybe we have time for one more question. Do we have another question?
No, I don't see any other questions coming in.
All right, so what I will, whoops, I don't know why that, nope. What I will do, I'm going to share my screen one more time. And whoops. All right, I'm having trouble sharing my screen. One more time. Okay, there we go. I wanted to give you our contact information. This is both from myself and for Emma. If you have a question, as Emma mentioned, that you didn't feel comfortable asking today, or if you have other questions that come up, please feel free to email us. We would love to answer those questions for you. Another great way to stay involved and informed is to follow us on social media. We put a lot of great educational content, as well as just kind of things that are going on. That's a great way to stay informed and educated. So please feel free to follow us on social media, and we would love to hear from you. So thank you so much for having us here today as part of your training. We really enjoyed being with you and your great questions. So, and also a special thank you to Noah for being here and sharing your story. Thank you so much, Noah. Goodbye, everyone.
Oh, wait, Tracy.
Oh, yes.
I just want to remind folks that I'm putting a resource doc in the chat, and then a survey in the chat as well.
Thank you, Emma. This is why I can't do it without Emma. Yes, please, there's a survey. I know you have lots of trainings today. If you go ahead and open it up, keep it in another tab. It's really important for us to hear feedback about what you thought was helpful, what you'd like to see more of. We'd love to get your feedback. So even if you can't do it now, please open it up and fill it out at some point. We really do very much read that feedback and look forward to it. So thank you, Rachel and Juan, for bringing us in. Have a great rest of your day.
All right.
Thank you,
you.
Tracy.
Thank you.
Emma.
Thank you.
All right, bye.